The IEA was deemed crazy for suggesting that the cost of HS2 could spiral above 80 billion.
We're getting half the rail. It is going to cost at least double what was initially projected.
I think even American classical liberals now have a decent chance of reclaiming the term. The woke socialists, they never call themselves liberals. They hate that label. He's trying to, in this case, punish the Brits for taxing American companies more heavily than they should. And in this case, he just calls every tax measure he doesn't like somehow an attack on American companies.
If you have disincentives for investment in America, then I think it will also lead to Americans being poorer.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Tom Clougherty, Executive Director here at the IEA, and I'm joined this week by my colleagues, Daniel Freeman, our Managing Editor, and Kristian Niemietz, our Editorial Director. This week we're going to be talking about high-speed rail too, about whether we should still describe ourselves as liberals, and about Donald Trump's one big beautiful tax bill. We'll jump right into it in a second, but first, your regular reminder, please subscribe to this channel and also sign up for the IEA's Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. So, Daniel, let's start with HS2. It's going to cost over 100 billion, and even so, there is no known opening date for it. Yeah, at least no such date can even be imagined in government. What on earth is going on?
Yeah, so this week, Heidi Alexander, the Transport Secretary, announced that the previous delayed deadline for HS2 opening between London and Birmingham, which was 2023, is now impossible. So it has been delayed again, but with no fixed date set out. So it's kind of actually depressing reading through some of the old articles about this from the early 2010s, because you get sort of analysis saying that by 2026, at least the first half will be completed, will be ready to get on trains from London to Birmingham. And then the whole thing will be finished probably by the late 2020s. Now, since then, a lot has changed. So most notably, the high-speed rail is now no longer going up to Leeds. It's no longer going up to Manchester or Liverpool. It is stopping in Birmingham. And yet, despite this, as you point out, it is going, even though we're getting half the rail, it is going to cost at least double what was initially projected. So in the 2013, the estimate was that it's going to cost 35 billion for the entire route up to Leeds. Now we're looking at kind of a minimum of 60 billion, but everything so far has gravitated towards that price going up. Yeah,
I mean, Kristian, I'm old enough, and so are you, to remember when the IEA was deemed crazy for suggesting that the cost of HS2 could spiral above 80 billion. I mean, it does sound like we're going to be heading north of that if we ever complete the damn thing. Why is it so expensive to build a railway, or for that matter, anything else?
Well, I mean, that's part of the problem. So there are IEA publications from, I think, 14 years ago, the first paper that kind of did predict this, that did say there's no way it's going to open by 2026, which was the original deadline. And it was still operating on the assumption that costs would be something like much less than half of what we're talking about now. And the paper already said, no, it's not going to be anything like that. It's going to be delayed, and there will be overruns in terms of costs and on the timelines. And then the paper was concerned with demand forecasts, saying that these are wrong too, and the business case doesn't really stack up because, one of the problems with it is that it's not really that much faster than the next best alternative. And that's what makes this an unusual project for a high-speed rail line. There's nothing wrong with high-speed rail per se. So there is one, there's a French one, which links Paris to Frankfurt, and where you can get there in, I think, less than 3 hours or so. So I take that one sometimes when I take the Eurostar to Paris and then visit the family, get off a bit before Frankfurt. And there, the difference is really, I remember at one point, they had a a train driver strike on that route. Surprise, surprise. And I looked up what would be the next best alternative. How else can I get there? And there, the next best alternative that can easily take more than twice as long. It can take the whole day. And then, yes, a high-speed rail line makes sense because it's a major upgrade compared to the next best alternative. If you already have train lines in place and if it's about speeding it up a little, making it a bit more convenient, then the business case is much weaker. Nonetheless, so that paper and there were several follow-up papers, even though that is all aged well, sadly, ideally, this is the sort of paper that you don't want to age well, where you would like to say, oh, well, we were too pessimistic, it turned out better than expected. It aged well, but in hindsight, I think one thing that we either should have done maybe differently then or should do differently now, maybe for a follow-up publication. One thing I would be interested in is to what extent is this project just in itself unviable? And to what extent is this a peculiarity of the thing that we always talk about here, the British planning system, that a project like this is more expensive here than it would be elsewhere? So if we could build this under, say, French planning laws, if we could build this under Spanish planning laws, would it be viable then or some other one?
Well, yeah, I think there is pretty good evidence that it would at least be a lot cheaper. You might have questions about the business case overall, but we do have a really good experiment of this. The French high-speed rail link, the TGV, between Tours and Bordeaux is almost exactly the same length as as high-speed 2 between London and Birmingham. That opened in 2017 at the cost of just under €8 billion.
Wow.
For the entire thing. And it's perfectly plausible now that we are going to end up spending 10 times that on a route that is the same length and also ends up taking us about twice as long as the French system. So I think there definitely is something to the idea that Britain in particular has, as we all know, has very bad planning laws and environmental regulations that make it very, very difficult to build anything, regardless of whether it's rail infrastructure or motorways or tunnels or houses. So in many ways, the sort of spiraling expense of high speed 2 is just a reflection of a broader sickness.
I mean, you could say, I suppose, the French are just really good at these grand projects. Maybe that's why they will say that in French, right? But I don't think that's true, actually.
And it's true for smaller projects too. So there was this infrastructure comparison, I think it was Sam Dimitriou who wrote it, where he looks at much smaller projects as well, sometimes just a tram line within the city. And you always get, it's not a 10-to-1 ratio necessarily, but you always get things elsewhere costing about half as much or a third as much. And you always get this cost difference for a given unit of a given infrastructure type. It's always much more expensive to build it here than pretty much anywhere else.
Yeah, I think, funnily enough, I think we've all read the same piece. And so, thank you to our friends at Britain Remade for the assistance with this podcast. But I mean, I think the point I was going to make was you could look at Italy and they've built a similar high-speed rail link for about half the price between Naples and Bari. You can say maybe it's just because we're tunneling so much. And if we hadn't caved to the NIMBYs and put so much of it underground, we might have been okay. But then Japan has built a very heavily tunneled high-speed rail link, I think at less than a third of the price that we're going to be paying for HS2. And of course, it's not just about high-speed rail. I think there's quite a nice little link here, actually, because I remember when the Conservatives, then in opposition, but in their 2010 general election manifesto said, we will rule out a third runway at Heathrow. And instead, we will build a national network of high-speed trains. And so that was meant to be the trade-off. We won't do this infrastructure project. We'll do that infrastructure project instead. Now, in fact, what we've done is spent a huge amount of money effectively doing neither of them.
Yeah.
And I think you can just sort of multiply that up across Britain. That we're not good at building things.
Yes.
We know this. When we do build things, it takes forever. It's extremely slow. I have to think that the main reason for that is rooted in our planning system, and in particular, just the amount of different veto players, people we've empowered to block things, or at least slow them down. And so it's everything from, and then of course, you get this real nervousness from the developers. They want to try and head off every possible objection in advance. So stuff gets gold-plated, and you have a million different consultations which run to hundreds of thousands of pages and all of this stuff. And you end up just sitting here and thinking, are we a serious country? Did we pioneer railways? Imagine trying to have an industrial revolution with the modern planning system. It's just incomprehensible, right? That could happen.
Yeah, we'd still be in 1750.
Yeah.
We'd still be running consultations about the first railway line.
So I think the other thing to bear in mind here is that we seem to live in a kind of economy where agglomeration effects are quite important, where people coming together in towns and successful urban areas brings productivity enhancements, and this feeds into growth. And in most countries, you have lots of big, urban areas that have these kind of productivity enhancing agglomeration effects. Weirdly, in Britain, it's only London that seems to have that. And you might say, well, that's because London actually does have pretty good transport infrastructure. So it's a very big labour market. People can travel and get to where the opportunities and the jobs are. The effective size of the urban area is really much bigger, maybe even than its geographic size, because it's so well connected. You could extend that potentially and say the problem with a lot of our other cities, and they may have lots of different problems, but it could be that the problem with those other cities is they're really badly connected. And if you had good, I would hope, privately financed, profitable infrastructure investment in those places, maybe that would help level up, as they say, in a way that would have benefits overall.
I suppose also one of the problems that a lot of our cities have by comparison to many continental European cities is that they're just really not very dense. Which means even if you do spend quite a lot on transport infrastructure, you need more of it to have 80% of the population of a city living within.
Right.
I think the Centre for Cities did a paper on this a while ago, where if you have more people living in relatively dense areas, it means you're able to have fewer you get more bang for your buck when it comes to transport.
So I think compared to European cities, maybe we're less dense and we don't have as good public transport. Then compared to American cities, we just have much less effective road access across urban areas. So which may be more aesthetically pleasing, but maybe not economically that helpful. I mean, Kristian, is there anything we can do? Where do we start?
Well, I mean, yes, absolutely. So, as is often the case, Switzerland is the obvious. As is often the case, Switzerland is the obvious comparison. They don't have a single massive city, but they have lots of medium-sized and small cities that are very well connected and that function effectively like a single integrated labor market. And of course, this isn't all planned from the center. They have local and regional policy decision-making in those areas with local and regional taxes, and that is the way to do it. But then you still need to get rid of the veto players, of course. You can't have a massive consultation project about everything and then nothing ever gets built, ultimately. I mean, that's not how the Victorians did things. They just got on with it and built stuff.
Yeah. And I guess often, and not just in the Victorian period, but later as well, building the transport infrastructure went hand in hand with building the kind of housing and other development which would pay for the infrastructure itself. And it seems that we've separated those things out to such a great degree. We've tied them all up in red tape, that whatever good incentives and potential trade-offs were there in the past, we've ruled them out now.
Yeah, there are big economies of scope there. It was often the rail operating companies or the infrastructure providers that also owned some of the land around the future rail links, and they knew, okay, this is going to increase the land value and we're going to develop this, and you can put those two together.
Well, I'm glad to have discovered another question to which the answer is Switzerland. We've got a long-running...
Except when it comes to the wealth tax.
Well, indeed. And we're not going to talk about that this week, but we probably will come back to it at some point. Let's move on to our second topic. And Kristian, I think this is one for you. You wrote a piece for the IEA Substack this week. You were responding to Rod Liddle, who has said basically people like us should stop calling ourselves liberal. It doesn't mean what we think it means anymore, and we should just forget about it. Why don't you outline the essence of your response to Rod Liddle?
Well, I'm saying it does mean what we think it means, at least in this country. So, of course, American English is a bit different. There, liberal for a long time has meant left-wing, and fair enough. So that's why when I write for an American publication, I don't use the word liberal, because I know that that's going to lead to unnecessary ambiguities and confusion. But it would be wrong to conclude that that must automatically be true in Britain as well. And here you sometimes get commentators who do use liberal in the sense of left-wing and then slag off the liberals and rail against the liberals. Usually these are very culture war focused people. So they use liberal when they actually mean the woke. And Rod Liddle, in this article in The Spectator, he was telling us, look, this is just what liberal means now. So if you want to call yourself liberals, you're just wrong. You're using it in a way in which the meaning that it may have had 30 or 40 years ago. But I don't buy that at all. So there may be some misunderstanding that maybe, as is often the case with political terms. So for some people, maybe liberal isn't so much a political philosophy, but more of a live and let live lifestyle attitude. But even there, if that's the confusion, we can probably live with that. That would not be completely far-fetched and totally removed from the proper meaning. But otherwise, it doesn't really, I don't remember instances where calling myself a liberal would have caused massive misunderstandings. That's not normally the issue. And so ideally what we would, I agree with Rod Liddle on the general principle. He says, look, words have no intrinsic meaning. If people think liberal means woke, then that's what it means. And I agree with that. If that's how people understand it, if that were the case, then I would stop using the word. I wouldn't insist on continuing to use it and run around with a dictionary and say, no, but look here, that's what it actually means. No, I accept language isn't logical. It means whatever people think it means. But I just don't think that many people in this country use liberal when they mean woke or progressive or far-left socialist.
Yeah.
And in particular, the people who Rod Liddle is talking about, the progressives, say Guardian readers or Guardian writers, they don't call themselves liberals normally. So they don't want that label. Why? If they wanted to claim it, it would probably be quite difficult to take it away from them. But they don't want it.
Yeah.
It's ours.
I mean, it does feel like sometimes Britain is in a weird halfway house on this. Because in the US, yes, clearly liberal does mean something different from what we mean by it. And so one would tend to use the term libertarian there if you wanted to be a bit more precise. In Europe, on the other hand, my impression is that liberal really does mean what we think it means. And then Britain, because I suppose we're a European country, but we're English speaking, and so we're very influenced by American online discourse and everything else, and popular culture. Maybe a lot of people now take liberal to mean what it means in America. Although I think you make the point in your piece that even liberal in America normally means the kind of moderate centre-left.
Yeah. Ezra Klein.
Sort of Ezra Klein or Bill Clinton or whatever. It doesn't mean extreme left, who would call themselves progressive generally or socialist or whatever else. I'm curious to ask you this though, Daniel, because I get this sometimes from very conservative friends or maybe people who are more on the culture war populist side, who absolutely insist that extreme woke ideology, or if you want to say just like a massive emphasis on identity politics, they seem to see this as the logical endpoint of individualism. Now, to me, that seems ludicrous. But do people kind of raise this to you as well?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you get this from kind of blue laboury types, the idea that, basically individualism or even markets and capitalism will just inevitably lead to, the sort of great awakening that you got in the 2010s coming out of America. I just don't really buy that at all. I think it's much more contingent. It's much more, I think, based in large part on, particularly in America, discontent with their form of like liberal Democrats, in the sense that you had Obama becoming president in 2008, and then even though there were some achievements from the perspective of Democrats, there was quite a profound sense of disappointment, particularly as you're getting into his second term, that you haven't seen this sort of total transformation of the nation, and that's combined with online discourse becoming increasingly influential in real life, and that the people who sort of gained the most ground early on were people who were actually in the US, like, explicitly not describing themselves as liberals. They were arguing that Obama liberalism has got us into this mess. We need to push further and harder, and for weird and quite complicated reasons, that ended up becoming dominant inside parts of the Democratic Party in America, and then that has influences across particularly the English-speaking world, because we take a lot of our cues from the US.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the fundamental misunderstanding for me here is to think of identity politics or woke ideology, if you want to call it that, as individualist. Now, some people will say, well, because it's all about defining yourself and all about your identity, it must be an expression of individualism. But it actually seems to me it's almost a pure form of collectivism. It's more about people trying to conform to particular labels. They might be new labels, and it might be a multiplying number of labels, but it is nevertheless an attempt not to see people as individuals, but to see them as members of different types of collective.
Yeah.
And so I think there's just a fundamental misunderstanding at the heart of that suggestion that classical liberalism or liberalism leads to the kind of culture war and the identity politics that we have. Slight change of tack. I think it's kind of interesting we're having this discussion now, because it seems to me that classical liberalism as a term and as a label is making a bit of a comeback. And maybe that's in response to the culture war on both sides. So it seems to me that a lot of conservatives, or people who would traditionally have described themselves as conservatives, but they are unhappy with the kind of Trump national populist side of things, are starting to call themselves classical liberals. And they mean it. They're not just adopting the term. They see their own ideology as something much closer to, I suspect, the things that we would believe in, and that classical liberal tradition that stretches back to Adam Smith and probably beyond as well. Equally, I think you've got people from the centre-left who are starting to call themselves classical liberals, because they're trying to distance themselves from some of the other parts of their movement who had become very woke, very kind of anti-free speech, very censorship and cancelling and all of that stuff. Now, I think classical liberalism is a broad enough church to accommodate those people as well. Now, they may not necessarily be as free market as the people coming in the same direction from the right. But I think broadly speaking, you can describe what they believe in as liberalism. And it's sort of normally, it might be fairly centrist on economics for the most part. I'll take that these days, even though I want to go a lot further. But they're very keen on free speech and individual freedom and all of that kind of stuff as well. Could we be in a sort of... I'm not going to say a classical liberal moment, because that would suggest that we were going to win in short order and become a kind of dominant force. But is it the case that even if it's a minority, classical liberalism is becoming maybe a slightly broader but still coherent part of the political landscape at the moment?
It seems that way, yes. And it's definitely become easier to reclaim the term. So to the extent that it even needs to be reclaimed. So I'm saying in British English, that was never really necessary in the first place. Liberalism still broadly means classical liberalism. And it's really only Rod Liddle type culture warriors who use it in the sense of woke. That's not the established meaning. But what we see is, on the one end, so even in the American meaning, even there, liberalism I think even American classical liberals now have a decent chance of reclaiming the term. And they probably have more work to do than we have over here. But even for them, it's become possible, in part for the reason that you mentioned, that the more center-left types, they want that label in order to distance themselves from the socialists and to woke progressives. And on the other side as well, the woke socialists, they never call themselves liberals. They hate that label, and they would protest if you describe them as liberals, and they use it pejoratively. Jacobin magazine and Current Affairs magazines like that, they hate the word liberal.
Well, we even see this actually with the term neoliberal, which I think has almost from the beginning started as more of a pejorative term for describing something you're not. But increasingly, you've seen people, particularly in the US, actually adopt on kind of what you call the US left of center or center-left, kind of adopt this title, basically to say like, yes, we like a certain, the government should exist, and we like some elements, some government programs, and some degree of redistribution, but also we don't want to overthrow capitalism. And because, if you said that in, say, 2019 on Twitter, for example, you'd get loads of Jacobin readers sort of piling on you, calling you a neoliberal and various other things. And so some people start saying, well, okay, fine, I'm a neoliberal.
Yeah.
Even though the meaning of it may be different from what other self-described neoliberals would.
Yes, it's a bleeding heart center-left neoliberalism. But if that's what it takes to build a slightly broader church, then I'd accept that as well. And there is just this moment now where you have the center-left YIMBYism. And if we can bond over that with some people on the center-left, then that's great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, I tend to see neoliberalism as a slightly different thing from classical liberalism. Now, that's not to say that neoliberalism isn't sort of the second best option, or that I wouldn't take it over most of the alternatives that get offered through contemporary politics. But it does seem to me to imply a kind of very technocratic managerial approach to politics and government, which has a sort of a flavor of classical liberalism. But it's not exactly in its pure or approaching pure form. And I think one can argue that neoliberalism, that when people say, you guys have had your chance, you've had your era, and look how rubbish it's been. What they're talking about is the kind of bureaucratic neoliberalism, which sort of gradually emerged in the 90s and the 2000s, and everyone's a bit fed up with. It isn't, to me, and perhaps I would just say this, but I don't think that's a reflection on the prospects or the effects or whatever of classical liberalism properly understood.
Yeah. No, but I think also we shouldn't be sort of dogmatic in like who we make alliances with. So, okay, I'm sure lots of us would have loads and loads of disagreements with, Ezra Klein, for example, who thinks there should be a big role for the state in supporting certain infrastructure projects and research and development, or a lot of the sort of Labour YIMBY people in the UK. But on a lot of the most important fundamental issues, like should it be basically impossible to build anything in this country? Well, there's an obvious sort of shared interest there. Yeah. And then, okay, once you've dealt with that, then you can start having debates about, what proportion of new houses should be affordable, what proportion should have, should you have any social housing? But that seems to me to be very much a secondary question to dealing with the massive...
And that's because here, YIMBY versus NIMBY, it makes sense that has become the alignment issue, because that is the bottleneck of the economy. So I would probably have different priorities if I lived in France.
Yeah.
And if I had to choose between, say, there's a right-winger who wants lower taxes, a more deregulated labor market, but who is also a bit of a NIMBY. I think if I lived in France, I would say, well, the NIMBYism doesn't really bother me that much, because here the housing stock is pretty big, infrastructure building fairly easy, energy generation fairly easy. I'll take a bit of NIMBYism, doesn't do that much harm, but we we need to cut taxes, need to deregulate the labor market. Yeah. That would be, in a French context, I'd have more in common with that NIMBY-ish right-winger than with a leftish YIMBY. But in the context of this country, it's exactly the other way.
This is actually one of the most sensible things Karl Marx and Engels ever argued for, which was that okay, we are communists and our end goal is totally different from the sort of romantic socialists like, Proudhon or from the liberals, the classical liberals. But in different countries, it might make sense to align with them. So in Germany, they say, well, because you're existing under absolutist regimes, of course you're going to align yourself for the time being with liberals. Whereas in other more advanced countries, well, you sideline the liberals and pursue your own agenda. Now, obviously, their objectives were very, very bad. But as a sort of strategic insight and point of view, that strikes me as being entirely sensible.
Yeah.
And we should learn more from them.
Well, one last question on this before we move on that bombshell. Is it useful? Is it productive in public debate to have a clearly identified sort of philosophical school that you are part of? Or is it better just to engage on specific issues? I think, frankly, it's probably too late for all of us and for the IEA to be a sort of issue-based group rather than representing a broad philosophical school that we call classical liberalism. But you do see more and more people engaging in the public debate, and it's kind of hard to work out exactly where they're coming from unless you know them well. But they will just focus on very specific issues and very specific agendas. That's something different from what we do. But just, your impressions. Is kind of ideological baggage, is sort of philosophical coherence helpful or a hindrance?
Well, it depends. Most people are not going to reinvent the wheel when it comes to forming political opinions. So you will fall into categories that are already established, and that's mostly, for the most part, fine. And it is also true that if you look at some of the Hayekian themes, they just come up again and again. So this idea that we know very little about economic life, let's just try different things, let's work things out. That's something that you can apply across the board to a broad range of issues, and that does make sense. So I don't see a problem with having a general view that you apply to a variety of issues. What I don't normally do is use a kind of language that immediately shows I'm in this camp, not in that one. I try to avoid tribal language, or I don't even actively try to avoid it. I've just never really done it, and that's generally fine. So it's not that I try to hide where I'm coming from politically, but most of the time you just describe an issue in a way that doesn't needlessly put people off right from the start.
Yeah, I think sometimes there's a false dichotomy between pragmatism and having a broad set of principles. I think one of the main issues that governments in the UK have had over the last decade or so is that, well, particularly under Boris Johnson and even Rishi Sunak, and even to a large extent with the current government, is there isn't really a clear sense of like what they want, what is the end goal, what is the world that they are trying to build. So you get a load of sort of floundering on different policies that don't really add up to much. And that actually, from just a purely pragmatic political point of view, has really seriously damaged a series of governments, because it's like different parts of government are working towards different objectives. And yeah, I totally agree with the idea that you shouldn't just sort of, that you should never pick your battles. You should always just go, you have the end goal of, fully automated luxury communism or fully automated luxury liberalism. And you should just go for it and ignore all other pragmatic political or economic concerns. Yeah, you should you should pick your battles. But I think it is actually just from a purely pragmatic perspective, it's good to have a goal because then people can work towards that. And there's a default, so you don't get as much sort of clashing objectives between different areas of government.
I think that's right. I think you do need division in any kind of politics. Where are you going? What are you sort of dreaming of? What are you aiming for? And a sort of philosophical school will provide that to a certain extent. I also think that probably people tend not to sort of process individual policies on a case-by-case utilitarian basis. They tend to kind of join a club and adopt the platform. So I think we can carry on calling ourselves classical liberals to draw that one to a conclusion, and trying to win as many other people round to that way of thinking as possible. So let's move on to our last topic, which is Donald Trump's one big, beautiful tax bill. It's certainly big, and it appears to be a bill. I'm not sure there's very much that's beautiful about it. I mean, let's start with the positive. It will extend most of the expiring provisions of the 2017 tax reform, which I think if you leave aside, and this is quite a big leaving aside, but if you leave aside the fact that it massively ramped up government borrowing in the US, increased the deficit and so on, those were by and large very good pro-growth tax measures. So things like full expensing, income tax rate cuts, and also changes to allowances, a whole host of other things, actually some quite sensible limitations on tax deductions that they get in America, the state and local tax deduction, which I don't think we need to go into great detail about for our audience, but it's a very foolish feature of a tax system, also mortgage interest deduction and so on. Basically, I think the 2017 tax reform attempted to lower taxes. It attempted to simplify taxes in a very complex environment in the US. And it also changed the corporate tax base in a way which is extremely pro-growth. Now, tax reform and tax legislation in America pretty much always has the provisions expiring within 10 years because they do all of their budget modeling on a kind of 10-year basis. So what you need to have when you introduce a reform is for all of your expensive measures that cost revenue to appear to disappear at the end of that period. So after 10 years, things don't look too bad from a budget standpoint. But I think it's a good thing, and it would be an even better thing if they could find a way of offsetting the fiscal cost through spending reductions. But it's a good thing that those provisions are likely to be extended. If we look at the rest of the tax bill, though, it seems to me to be a complete and utter mess. So no taxes on tips or overtime pay, and a new deduction for car loans as long as it's an American car. And it's this kind of like pandering to specific groups of voters and doing things which are profoundly distortionary to economic behaviour in many respects. And then the big one, which one of our colleagues wrote about for City AM this week, this withholding tax that they're planning to introduce, so that effectively foreign investors in the US or non-resident investors in the US would see the Inland Revenue Service withhold massive chunks of dividends and capital gains or whatever before they were paid out, seemingly in violation or in effect repealing lots of international tax treaties that we have at the moment, which say if you're a foreign investor and you're investing over here, you will be taxed in your country of residence, and any withholding will be eliminated or at least minimized. This seems sort of mad, that a country would tax foreign investment, but surely most countries would welcome foreign investment. And so I wonder if there's something weird going on here. Any thoughts? Would you care to speculate?
I mean, I don't know. I suppose in some ways, this is another example of one of the problems that you get when you don't really have a very clear overarching ideology. And that's one of the issues with the current Republican Party in the US, that it is now heavily aligned with the whims of the president, which are not very consistent in a lot of ways, except on the issue of trade. That this is one area where he has been really consistent, that basically if you are importing lots from another country, you're getting screwed, because you're just getting their stuff and they're getting, dollar bills, which is obviously, you're giving them money. So what you should try and do is, eliminate trade deficits as far as possible. Now, what classical liberals often point out, and economists just in general, it's not really an ideological position, is that, if you have massive amounts of investment, if foreigners want to invest in your country, then that is basically the flip side of having a trade deficit, because loads of dollars are coming in to buy up shares in American firms and to invest in American factories and that sort of thing. And so that money is in America, so then you now spend it on buying stuff from other countries. Now, that to me sounds like a really good deal. But from the perspective of the Trump White House, that is bad, because again, importing stuff, bad. So potentially this is trying to address this. If you have disincentives for investment in America, then it's possible there will be less sort of it will over time lead to a smaller trade deficit. I think it will also lead to Americans being poorer, but that doesn't seem to be a very significant concern.
It doesn't. So maybe economists have messed up here. We've been saying, don't worry about trade deficits. It's balanced by an investment surplus. And now they're saying, we don't like the investment surplus either. Let's
stop it up then. The problem with it is, so his justification for this is that he says this is a retaliation against countries that provide a tax-hostile environment for American companies. And he's trying to, in this case, punish the Brits for taxing American companies more heavily than they should. So this is like the mirror image of his approach to non-tariff barriers, where he just calls everything he doesn't like a non-tariff barrier when it comes to trade. And in this case, he just calls every tax measure he doesn't like somehow an attack on American companies. Specifically in the British case, what puts us into the naughty corner is the digital sales tax, which, most digital providers being American companies, that is a tax which effectively hits American companies more heavily than companies from elsewhere. Although it's not the intention, it just happens to be the case that they are.
I think it might be the intention, actually.
And this is not, it is not just a weird Trumpy thing to object to this. Like the Biden administration was also, very much not a fan of this, because it does overwhelmingly hit US companies.
Yeah. And I do think it's a terrible tax, the digital services tax, for what it's worth, partly because it's a tax on turnover, not a tax on profits, partly because it really seems to have no logical or principled basis to me. It's just saying, well, look, that's where the money is, let's try and grab a chunk of it. And it does discriminate against big American tech companies. But we cut you off.
Yeah, but ultimately, the people paying for this, it's not really the American companies, because digital services, that's a competitive sector where most of the tax, I haven't seen an empirical estimate or breakdown of this, but I would be very surprised if it turned out that the biggest effect of this is going to be a reduction in the profits of American digital companies. I think it's much more likely that this gets passed on to consumers. And that is probably part of the intention, certainly when it comes to... So part of the justification was that we have to save the high street, and it's unfair that online sales platforms, they don't have to incur the costs of offices, physical premises on the high street that traditional retailers are facing, and that's unfair competition. Whereas I would say, well, no, that just means they have found a way to get around a cost, to cut out a cost. They are able to provide a service in a cheaper way, and that's great. There's nothing unfair about that. That's just a different business model which is specifically designed to avoid that cost. And so in that case, in that sense, go ahead and do it. But the idea was really, let's penalize the the unfair competition against high street retailers. And I think that played a bigger part than anti-Americanism in it. So if there was a British Amazon, a British online retailer, they would also be considered political baddies.
Yeah, perhaps so. So, I mean, I think that there is, and we referenced it a little bit already, but there is this speculation that some in the Trump administration just really don't like the dollar being the global reserve currency. Like, they think that that has significant downsides, maybe in terms of allowing government to grow much bigger and more interventionist than it should. And so it's possible, maybe, and it may be overthinking it, that you can see this attempt to tax foreign investments in somewhat the same way, that they don't want people outside the US holding a lot of US assets, whether it's treasuries or whether it's dollars or whether it's stock in American companies and so on. And now we could probably talk about that whole idea at length another time. What I think is interesting here, though, is it sits rather uneasily against a bunch of tax provisions which are massively increasing the deficit and the debt to the tune of many trillions of dollars over the next decade. And do American policymakers realize that the ability they have to run massive deficits and do unfunded tax cuts is kind of unique? And it depends on their very particular position in the international economy.
Yeah.
And if that goes away, they'd be left rather more in a situation like us, where we have to worry about every penny we're borrowing because we're at the mercy of the international bond markets. And, obviously some British politicians occasionally find that out to their cost.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is the thing that, again, I'm not even convinced that the Trump administration makes that connection between the current account surplus and the trade deficit. The official justification is that by changing the tax code in that way, you force foreign governments to adopt a tax policy that is more favorable for American companies. But if it does that, then he would immediately have to, if he's consistent if they're consistent in their justification, then they would also have to change the tax treatment and go back to the old lower withholding tax, where you don't have the double taxation of foreign investors. And if you do that, then you are going to maintain foreign investment into America, and then you will also maintain the ability to run a big trade deficit.
Are they still trying to claim that VAT or goods and services taxes are a trade barrier? Is that part of this argument?
It was originally. And Trump is not the kind of guy who says, "Oh yeah, I was wrong about this," and let's just forget about all that. So yes.
All right. Well, let's leave it there. Daniel, Kristian, thank you very much. And thank you to all of you at home for listening and or watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel and sign up for our Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. There you can receive all of our writing, some of which we've discussed on the programme today, as well as invitations to our events, notifications of our publications, and much more besides. But for now, see you next time.